'cause a new way you sound so sincere. How sweet it must be to be able to think so clear. But you're just another in a long line of fools. Giving us freedom with a new set of rules.
Hi all, thanks for joining us. My name is Darryl Egan, and today we're going to move into a little bit of geopolitics, but also some domestic politics in Australia. US commentators, this is an interesting point. US commentator Garland Nixon repeated an old saying: the right wing and the left wing are part of the same bird. Now, I'm 55 and I remember Gough Whitlam as a child. I reflect on the state of the current Labor Party in relation to Gough, and I can see Gough Whitlam was the Australian mythical Ouslan bird that flew its own way with one wing. I have in front of me a person you might consider who's an Ouslan bird, Robbie Barwick, from the Australian Citizens Party. Robbie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Darryl. Thanks for having me.
No problem, mate. First question I'd like to ask you, it's in the way we're moving towards a multipolar world now, and this is something I think in the Citizens Party you're right across, with the world being at an inflection point in regards to moving towards a multipolar world. And in the US, a new political party called the People's Party have broken off from what can be described as the left-wing, right-winged warhawk political duopoly of Democrat and Republican. This is sort of a symptom of the movement towards a multipolar world. So in your perspective, how do you see this development, and what opportunities can come from this?
Well, I do think that the opposition to the war agenda that is bipartisan in America, the war agenda is absolutely bipartisan. You have, neoconservatives on the Republican side, and you have, they like to call themselves liberal interventionists on the Democratic side, and that leads to there's a funny meme of a B-52 bomber dropping bombs in just, typical army colors, and then a B-52 bomber dropping bombs in rainbow colors, right? The net result down below on the ground is mass death and destruction. And those people did not care who got, if Hillary Clinton got elected or Donald Trump got elected, right? That's what war is. And so the war is bipartisan, and it's got to be resisted. And Americans have to go back to, in one sense, their own roots. And the roots aren't perfect, but I was just sharing this on Twitter the other day. One of their better early presidents, John Quincy Adams, famously said, "We Americans love democracy, we love freedom and liberty, and we wish those things upon all countries, but it's not our place to go and impose it on them. We go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." And he said, and if we did do that, we would get ensnared in wars abroad that would be the source of our corruption at home. And this was said in 1821, 200 years ago, right? And he wrote the script of what America is like today. So when you see political breakaways that are also bipartisan, right, that are not getting hooked up, hung up on the old left-right divide, and saying, no, look, when it comes to the big issues, and there's no bigger issue than averting a nuclear war, we better all be on the same page here. Let's agree on that. Let's agree on averting a nuclear war first, which is what we've been brought to the brink of. Let's agree on that first, and then we can argue about our preferred way of running the economy, right? And that part of it is very, very important. So I think that's a positive, and frankly, I'm trying to be part of the same impulse in Australia, right? Getting people from all vantage points to look at what we agree on here, the common ground of, hang on, we cannot we cannot let our differences divide us and stop us from fighting these things that are going to destroy us, especially nuclear war. So, and hopefully we can achieve the same thing.
Just on that point, Robbie, the old traditional left believed in economic sovereignty, like your party does. The old left believed in anti-war. Gough Whitlam took us out of Vietnam, which your party believes in. What I find interesting about the current, actually liberal left in the US and Australia is they virtual signal on a lot of issues. However, there is things in our past that are not good, and we have to admit it, what happened to Indigenous First Nations people, and we've got to find a way of having those discussions and fixing it. But what's interesting is they virtual signal on thinking they say they care about those issues, yet they're colonising in other countries and supporting that. They're supporting the colonisation and bombing and intervention of other countries. So it's a hypocrisy at a higher level. So the virtual signal to their public at home and say, oh, we're all squeaky clean and good. But what they're supporting in other countries is horrible. So yeah.
That I came to the conclusion a little while ago that hypocrisy is the currency of foreign affairs, international affairs. Unfortunately, it is so hypocritical what countries are prepared to countenance happening to other countries, but not to themselves. Right? That's why we're also as a party very much committed to the principle of national sovereignty, not in a nationalistic way in the worst sense of that term, but in the fact that the national good, right? I frankly don't think you can actually, if you think democracy is important, I don't think you can have democracy unless you have a strong sovereign nation, right? Because the further you get away from the voters, some people on the left would like some kind of a world government, but there's no way a world government will ever be democratic, right? You need to have people that can reflect the views of the people of the nation. You need to have a government that reflects the views of the people of the nation, but you don't have to have the sovereign nations that are all chauvinistic. What we need is a community of sovereign nations that all recognize, hang on, fundamentally our interests are the same. We will all benefit from peace and economic development that can come from periods of peace, etc. And we can collaborate together on that.
Can I go on a point on that? Is having some sovereignty is like in your household or your family. You've got some protection to look after the interests of your family.
Yeah.
And that's what the point you're driving is, that we need that space to take care of our family. We don't need someone knocking on our door every 5 minutes, interrupting us, telling us what to do. And we need that space. And every person in a relationship needs that space. I'm not going to bother you every 2 minutes with my opinions of what you should be doing. So my next question is, can you tell me, and this is something about a person that we both know, can you tell me about some backdoor links with the anti-China activist Chris Pavpoo, in my opinion, because I think he's full of you-know-what, and that is in my researched opinion, in relation to that man. Can you tell me instances, or could you tell me if there's any backdoor links between him and the current Labor Party? Because quite frankly, he's taken some actions that could be described as racist as well. And could you describe describe any instances where he's undertaken such activity that could be described as racist? And if the so-called liberal left people in Australia, Labor, are supporting this guy, I want to be exposed some of the actions what can be described as racist that he's done, and any backdoor links that he's got with the Labor Party. So go ahead, Robbie.
Yes, I'll use his proper name just for clarity. Drew Pavlou. This 23-year-old, I think he is now, at the former student at the University of Queensland, who's become the poster boy for anti-China activism in Australia, and he wants to make himself the poster boy around the world. And he's only become the poster boy because the media love boosting this guy. And so I have felt responsible on social media as a white Aussie who thinks his behavior is intolerable, who, if it was any other community other than the Chinese community, the whole country would be up in arms about his behavior. But because it's the Chinese community, his behavior is treated as if it's acceptable. So I've taken it upon myself to slap him down as much as I can online. He did the sort of things that Drew is driven by narcissism and ignorance. So he was only a baby when the people that he regards as the good guys in world politics, the Americans and the Brits, deliberately, not accidentally, let me say it, deliberately sat down and made up damn lies so they could invade a country and murder 1 million people. That's what they did. And he thinks they're the good guys in world politics, and the countries that did not participate in that war, did not approve of that war, and the big one that just got on with its own business of lifting its people out of poverty, he thinks they're more evil than the Nazis. That's Drew's worldview, right? Why? Because those same people who made up those lies about the Iraq war told him that. So with that viewpoint, he thinks he's a modern day crusader. He made a name for himself when he was holding protests in Australia at the time of the Hong Kong riots, the vicious, brutal, violent Hong Kong riots that terrorized the people of Hong Kong, backed by the US government. So he was holding protests here. But when COVID hit, these are the sort of antics he would do. He dressed in a hazmat suit and went to the Confucius Institute on the campus of the University of Queensland to parade around about the China flu, right? Making sure he didn't catch the China flu from any of the Chinese people at the Confucius Institute there. That's one example, and that's fair game, apparently, right? To be able to do that. Now, some people, some of your listeners may think, well, isn't that, people got to have a sense of humor. Well, okay, take that view if you like, but what I'll point this out to you, because in the terms that you put it, Daryl, you and I know that those liberal lefts in the Labor Party that we're talking about, they would never tolerate that for any other community. Right? There's a sort of a standard of public behavior now that we've come to accept. We've all had to sort of modify our behavior a little bit to adapt to it, right? That wouldn't be tolerated now for any other community, but that's what was tolerated for that community, the Chinese community in Brisbane. In the election earlier this year, he went to he deliberately found the suburb of Sydney that had the highest proportion of people of Chinese ethnicity, eastward, and went to the mall there and held up a sign in Chinese that said, Xi Jinping fucks your mother, fucks your mum. And the Chinese readers, Mandarin readers walking past were both, they were insulted by the vulgarity of it.
It's vulgar.
Right? And instantly, and knowing it was targeted at them. That this white guy, Greek Australian, Cypriot Australian, is essentially a white guy. He doesn't like to call himself that. Standing there was coming here to insult them, and he was saying it because he was there to insult Xi Jinping. And this particular altercation was filmed, and the guy who filmed it, who ended up because he was with Drew, ended up being roughed up a bit. He interviewed me a few weeks ago. He admitted to me that when he turned up at the protest, at Drew's little one-man protest, or a few men, and saw this sign, he himself said, "Oh, I'm glad I didn't bring my daughter along." So that was his reaction as a non-Chinese person to the vulgarity of this sign. And Drew thinks the fact that Chinese people reacted was proof that Xi Jinping controls Australia.
Rob,
anyway, that's what he does.
Rob, what he does, he also perpetuates other things like what happened to my wife. Now, he makes this acceptable. Like, my wife was going for a walk. This is during COVID. Now, my wife is from Macau, but her parents are originally from East Timor. So you can't sort of, in quote, consider her like Chinese. But her father's Chinese East Timorese, but her mother's East Timorese. So in descent. She was walking and a man coughed on her deliberately. It's like, here's your COVID.
Yeah.
Drew is virtue signaling or giving a green light for that type of action with what he does. And it is disgraceful. And as humans, we can't just say, oh, if it's targeting a certain race, it's racism, And that's like if I'm an Australian overseas and someone targets me as a specific race, right, and says, like, I've been called an Australian mainland pig, because on Facebook I was saying that there shouldn't be violence in Hong Kong, people getting burnt, because I lived in Macau for 4 years. I went back in 2019 when the riots were happening, saw videos, disgraceful videos of a man burned alive and so on, which we weren't reporting here. So my point of view, and then Vicky Shue can go on and talk about the stuff she's got, and that's unacceptable, the insults she got, but she'll never talk out against the ones that happened to me and others. So that's just hypocrisy. But he's giving a green light to this type of behaviour, which is totally unacceptable, and we should feel proud of that sort of behaviour as Australians.
And to answer the other part of your question, Drew is connected into the Labor Party. There's a network of the late Senator Kimberley Kitching, who died earlier this year unexpectedly. He claimed that she was like his second mum. And Kimberley Kitching was one of the Labor people in Parliament who calls themselves a Wolverine. And this is a bipartisan thing between Labor and Liberals. So on the Liberal side, you've got people like Andrew Hastie and Senator James Patterson. And the Wolverines was this little gang of juvenile politicians who named themselves after a 1985 American movie called Red Dawn, which was about high school students rising up to defeat an Asian invasion of America, right? And this is how they saw themselves. But as soon as I heard about them and started following their activities, and they're really juvenile, they go around Parliament putting stickers of claw marks on the walls, right? I recognise that what they actually are is US loyalists. That they were talking about sovereignty for Australia. They didn't mean sovereignty for Australia. They meant Australia's continuing subservience to the Anglo-American war machine. And so, his connection to that was through Kimberley Kitching, and Kimberley Kitching is part of a right wing. We're going to use that term, a neoconservative current in the Labor Party, involving people around her mentor, Michael Danby, right-wing parts of the Australian Workers' Union, where this came out during the election, that they were funneling money to Drew to fund his antics. A third racist thing I saw this as actually racist. Drew seems to have this habit of wherever a politician pops up who's Chinese to run for Parliament in Australia, he would target them, right? Because they were Chinese, and make up this whole thing about they were fronts for the Chinese government, the CCP, United Front Work Department, etc.
And no evidence. And no evidence he's got of it. I bet no actual evidence.
Well, they might. No, the evidence comprises things like attending something that was put on loosely associated with the United Front Work Department. But the United Front Work, like every government in the world, has soft power diplomacy, and that's all Confucius Institutes and the United Front Work Department are. But because it's them, what we accept from the Americans, the Americans use soft power to control Australia, essentially.
And I'd say more hard power in a lot of ways too.
Well, that's the more obvious thing. But they got the United States Studies Centre and the Perth US Asia Centre and the Australian American Leadership Dialogue and all these things they use to control politicians. The United Front Work Department has that stuff. Every country has it, right? I went to the 2019 Diwali celebration in Parliament House in Canberra. I was invited. There was so many politicians queuing up to pander to the Indian community, right? Because it's a big community. And that's like, but so what China does in this regard is absolutely normal, but it gets demonized because it's China.
Well, you have a lot of multicultural groups in Australia, like the Indian community and others, that have connections with their government departments that do cultural things. So discriminate on one group is ridiculous.
Daryl, sorry, just to contrast, we had two politicians we had two prime ministers in a row who were both British born, Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott. And the second one was, he might as well, he was still British. He brought back knighthoods. He was so British, right? And that's, his affinity to his home country is accepted as normal.
That's right.
Every ethnicity has the same kind of affinity, and the Chinese shouldn't be singled out for theirs.
Yeah, and you know what? When going back to what you're saying too, I don't want to use terms like right wing and left wing in this debate, because I think it's where we've got to come together on certain issues and how we have discussions, and we can't have this divide. we're in a bad shape at the moment around the world, and we need to be coming together and discussing what we get along with. We can have our separate ways, but we can discuss what we get along with and work together on attacking those issues. So that's why I'm not a person that likes to use those terms, a lot, or, you could say far right, like neo-Nazis, like in Ukraine. And I'm getting onto that in my next question. So on the topic of feeding perpetual war, as Julian Assange has shown to us what the US does, and in relation to Ukraine, I've undertaken detailed research in relation to neo-Nazi military and political control of Ukraine's body politic. And this is an issue even before the current intervention by Russia in February. This is not only my research, but the research of the leader of the Ukraine Jewish Committee, Edward Dolinsky, who has been put on a Ukraine hit list website, the same website that executed Russian Daria Dugina was put on, and she's marked as liquidated on this site. So Edward would be feeling all the freedom to talk now about the neo-Nazism in Ukraine, in what the West is saying, the Ukraine is such a democracy and freedom of speech country. So, and I'll include my research in the YouTube description, my research blog on this issue. He's been virtuous. He's been taken. He's stopped after February this year. He stopped commenting on Twitter and in Facebook, which is interesting. I think it was around a time not long after he got put on this hit list. What is your position in regards to the Liberal Party and now the Labor Party providing taxpayer-funded weapons and military training to Ukraine, which is most likely to consolidate the power of these neo-Nazi political and military factions in Ukraine? So, yeah, what we're doing is we're feeding, and mind you, Trevor the Ninja, who was on the news, is deceased now, fighting in Ukraine as an Australian foreign fighter, was fighting with the C-14 Carpathian Sich neo-Nazi Ukraine unit, which is one of their many Ukrainian neo-Nazi battalions. And even when you saw the 7 News report, on the building he was fighting in, when they showed the footage, was Carpathian C-14. So what more evidence do you want? So what's your opinion on this?
And just for C-14 is the 14 famous, was it the 14 words of Hitler, right? That's some phrase that Hitler used that was 14 words, and these neo-Nazi groups have adopted it. Is the other one 88?
So there's IDEA, who have a very similar logo to the Roland Battalion, the Nazi Roland Battalion. There's SS Galician, which has the Golden Lion, which is the Lviv Battalion. There's Right Sector, which have the OUNB nationalists, World War II, black and red colours, who the OUNB under Stepan Bandera massacred Jews in the Baba Yar massacre and the Lviv programs. Zelensky's gone on RBC TV saying, I support the day to celebrate Stepan Bandera, who led those massacres on Jews. So that's one, a Right Sector. There is a Totenkopf battalion of 72nd Brigade. There's a lot.
And the other thing about them is not just these existence of these groups, but their leaders are in key positions in the Kiev administration.
Correct.
And they were from 2014 onwards. They got into the key security roles, etc. And so what the Western press and politicians hide behind this fig leaf and say, these far right groups don't get more than 2% of the vote in the elections nationwide. Well, trust me, as a minor party, 2% nationwide vote is actually pretty significant if you can get it. But that's not the real power. The real power is where they're positioned in these key positions. And why do they have that power? Because they were deliberately picked up by the US government and backed to help foment this coup that gave them this control over Ukraine from 2014 onward that has led to this current war. That's why they got this power. So the Americans used them, and now the Americans and the Brits, and I've got to keep saying, not just the Americans and the Brits, and in fact, the British role in this particular conflict is now starting to dominate the Russian discourse about it, because the Russians are noticing that everywhere they turn, it's the British that are causing the most trouble. And there could have been a peace settlement back in March or April. The Ukrainians had agreed to terms, and it was the British who went over. Boris Johnson went over to Zelensky and said, no, you're not going to agree to that, right? We are being used here, right, by the British and the Americans to help keep this war going. And we need to take stock of what that means, right? There's nothing independent about it, the way Australia operates, unfortunately, Daryl. And it's, this is just a particular example of it. Also, as part of it, look at the fact that we are now being drawn closer into the NATO web. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and now we call ourselves partners of NATO, we and the Kiwis, the white countries in Asia. What does that tell our Asian neighbors, by the way, who've never attacked us, never invaded us, never threatened to invade us, right? That we think that for our security from these countries that have never been a threat to us, we need to be part of this bloc of white countries in the North Atlantic who do go around attacking and invading countries, right? This is really twisted stuff. And the final point is on Labor and Liberal complicity in this. You actually see it all the way down to the fact that you mentioned Bandera and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUNB. Well, the leading member of that in the world is an Australian, Stefan Romaniuk. And at the start of the year, he was having both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese hopped up in the parliament and stated openly that they had been having meetings with Stefan Romaniuk, the leading representative of the man who massacred those Jews in Ukraine, and it's all been whitewashed now. I mean, it's completely atrocious.
And the biggest problem here now is when you're talking about people say, oh, they don't have much that political power, only 2%. Zelensky's now shut down other political parties. Okay, so we've got a political vacuum. We're sending billions of dollars of weapon in the US, billions of dollars of weapon and aid going to these neo-Nazi groups. There's been reports that weapons go missing off the armory and being sold online. We could be consolidating their factional power, even though they have a lot of control of the inner levels of the Ukrainian government. We could be consolidating that even more in sending billions of dollars of weapons to them. So their power, a lot of their power is in the military, these neo-Nazi factions.
And by the way, and in doing so, we've actually made ourselves a belligerent in the war, right? Under the laws of war, Russia would be within its rights to attack Australia now because of the role that we're playing, right? So instead of us encouraging negotiation, and why should we be encouraging negotiation? Go back and look at someone like Paul Keating's warnings in 1997. He was one of the many statesmen around the world who said in the 90s, warn, if you keep expanding NATO up to Russia's border, it will end in war. And sorry, you don't have 30 years of really wise people warning about this for 30 years. And then when it gets to it and it causes a war, you blame the country that's reacting as if it's entirely its fault. On the you mentioned the banning of political parties. A lot of what we know about Ukraine, we have to research like everybody else. But on the banning of political parties, we know this firsthand. There's a political party over there called the Progressive Socialist Party that has been banned, and I have met the leaders of that party, and it's back in better days. So it's a party whose fortunes we've taken notice of, and that's one of 16 parties that have been banned. And the grounds for banning these parties are really spurious, such as if ever in the past they've advocated things like, oh, Ukraine should abide by the Minsk Accords. That is now taken as grounds to ban political parties today, even though those Minsk Accords were agreed to under international law, and it's because Ukraine didn't abide by them that we have this mess now.
Well, but Robbie, if anyone who who advocates peace gets put on this hit list website, like the leader of the Ukraine Jewish Committee. Roger Waters was put on it. I'm 55. It was probably of maybe your era of music. Roger Waters was put on this hit list website. I do want to get to the next question because time is going. I'd like to discuss this with you more in the future because it's a topic that needs to be talked about, and you have some really good knowledge on it. So it's great to hear that. Being Australian, and this is a new topic, but domestically, being Australian, I think it's important to learn from our Indigenous First Nations Australians. They're part of our nation. Before 1788, the Northern Australian Indigenous communities had trade relations with Malaysian Macassan seafarers for trepang, which is a sea delicacy used in Chinese medicine, which the Malaysian seafarers sold it directly to China. They never used it. There was speculation that Chinese seafarers came to Australia establishing this trade. The Indigenous groups that traded with these Asian seafarers without a xenophobic foreign policy still retained their cultural and material sovereignty. Right? This is very important. What this in mind do you think is another reflection to contemporary Australia that we can peacefully have a foreign policy and trade with China and retain our own cultural and economic sovereignty? And we can still retain that and trade with China. That's my point. What is your take on that? We don't have much.
No, look, it's true, and I'd have to put it, I suppose, in this way. So the sort of the level of civilization of the Aboriginal occupants of Australia was such that, you know, there's no real evidence that they went out seafaring, right? They tended to stay here, though they must have come here originally because Australia's always been cut off from the rest of Asia with a sea barrier, always, even at the height of the biggest ice ages and the lowest water sea levels. There's always been a water gap, and it's always required people to come here. And there's really great rock art in northern Western Australia called the Bradshaw Rock. We call it the Bradshaw Rock Art. There's lots and lots of it that shows really advanced people actually came here, and they show the pictures of canoes, etc. But we know Chinese civilization, which did, in the historical record, take to the seas. That goes back 5,000 years, that civilization, right? And what you see in this historical, what we understand about was the interaction between them, and there was that really famous voyage in 1492 that's been documented in the book about it. Them coming to Australia and trading, they did not think that, okay, we can take over this country, and they probably could have, right? They don't think that way. And in fact, no, apart from one aberration in the form of Japan in World War II, this is not the standard way that Asian countries think. Mahathir in Malaysia famously said a couple of years ago when he was being pestered about China again, he said, well, China's been our neighbor for 2,000 years. They've never invaded us. The Portuguese turned up in 1500 or whatever to trade. 2 years later, they came back and invaded us, right? And it's just reflecting as a different mindset. And so we need to this is a historical fact. We've never seen China go and invade countries. So stop being afraid. Stop letting ourselves be talked into this rubbish that we're under threat from China. We're not. Most of what you're being told, the specifics of China's so-called assertiveness, are just not true. And I can give you a chapter and verse on that if we have the time. But look, without going through all that, just look at the historical record. And if the fact you can trace it back to the Aborigines, and the Chinese could have taken over Australia if they wanted to, and they didn't, tells you something we should learn from that.
And no one's twisting our arm to change our cultural sovereignty, nor our economic sovereignty. So next question is, the Citizens Party believe development is needed for a sustainable economy. What is concerning that under the current system of development, it did not prevent Rio Tinto from destroying a priceless Indigenous historical site in Western Australia, I think it was, which is part of our national culture. With a more sovereign control of our national resource assets, will that give Australia a stronger regulatory control to prevent such destruction happening again? So if we have more sovereign control of our resources and those areas.
Well, this goes back to, well, first of all, as a curious aside, Rio Tinto is one of the biggest mining companies in the world. It's effectively foreign owned. It's British. In fact, the biggest individual shareholder was, well, it's now the King of England because it was the Queen of England. Charles would have inherited that. And they used to promote Indigenous causes, and probably still do for many years. But it's all tokenism on their part, right? Where they can use certain agendas to try and get other things through. And they showed their true colours when they blew up that site in Western Australia. Gough Whitlam and his resources minister, Rex Connor, tried to address this in the 70s. They tried to buy back the farm. And it wasn't getting Australian government ownership of our minerals. They just wanted Australian ownership of our minerals, right? That was what it was called, buy back the farm. And that involved them trying to borrow money to do certain investments, etc. It would have been $4 billion, which was, about $160 billion in equivalent today. That's not the biggest debt in the history of the world. But the British and American creditors who we usually borrowed from in those days and still do, London and Wall Street, they wouldn't lend it. They went on a capital strike against Australia. Why? Because they own the mining companies that Gough Whitlam and Rex Connor wanted to buy back. And they still do, right? It's the Anglo-American ownership of Australia's resources is huge. And in the last few years, Darryl, you would have heard that all the media brouhaha, Chinese investment in Australia. And it was only ever tiny, right? Chinese investment never even got to $100 billion at its max, whereas British and American investment is about $2.5 trillion cumulatively. They are our foreign landlords, those two countries. And we do have to take it back. And only when we do will we be able to make sure the rules are followed.
That's right. That's we've got to protect our cultural our national culture, and Indigenous sites. I personally believe are part of the Indigenous culture. See behind me that painting. It was done by given to me by the son of a famous Indigenous actor in Australia. I can't say his name under the culture, and that's something we can all learn about their culture. Is that when someone passes away, if we say their name and their culture, they believe that disturbs them a piece. So I can't say the person's name, but is an icon, and that was given to me. So I think we've just got to say that this is part of our history, and this is part of our culture, and we can't ignore that. And let's bring it into our national culture and embolden our national culture with that. And that's just my feelings on it.
And as we go forward, the nature of our culture will evolve, right? Because there's lots of different sources of culture now in Australia. But we need to be reflective of that and make sure we don't assume that it's going to be this white English-based culture all the time, right? We should just be happy when culture's mixed. They pick the best of each other's culture, not the worst.
Now, Robbie, we talked on the issues of Indigenous culture and how we should, retain the cultural sites. Another cultural icon is Australia Post. It's a big Australia icon, and it's got a lot of history, and it connected communities right around Australia and Indigenous communities in early times, which is one positive. Now, can you tell me about the Citizens Party's campaign in relation to having an Australia Post bank, which is a good way of using our current resources of Australia Post offices around Australia for a people's bank? And there was speaking of Matt Robson from New Zealand on this, there was a people's bank in New Zealand. I think it's still going. And I think there should be a bank for the people, in which is for the Australian people's benefit and supports Australians and looks after Australians and all of us in Australia. So what's your campaign on the this issue of a post office bank?
Well, first and foremost, we think we need a national bank, as in a government bank, to play an important role in the financial system. What we've had since 1996, when they privatised the Commonwealth Bank, is a financial system that's totally dominated by private banks. There's no public bank anymore. We didn't just have the Commonwealth Bank once. We had state banks and other public banks like the Commonwealth Development Bank, etc. We got rid of all of them. And so the private banks have had privately have had a monopoly. They would like us to believe that that sort of system is ordained by God. It has the mandate from heaven that public banks are somehow illegitimate. No, in Australia's history, we had them for 84 years, or we had the Commonwealth Bank for 84 years, from 1912 to 1996. This last 25 years has been the aberration. That was the norm, right? And we have been campaigning about how much Australia has lost its way economically because we don't have that. Because what happens when private banks, like most private, or pretty much all private corporations, are geared for maximum profit. But unlike other corporations that can only make profits by actually making and selling things or some kind of service, the banks deal in money, right? And they can manipulate that always to Sunday. And there's lots of, it gets really complicated. You get these amazing toxic products called derivatives that have blown up the world a few times almost, right? And if without a public bank that puts service first, right, providing a service to the people of Australia, these banks just go on a tear, and they don't care which customers they destroy, which communities they destroy to do it. So we need to balance that again, and that's what a public bank can do. Right now, it can provide investment for the community. It can do things like making sure that the banks don't get away with. The banks would like to turn us all off cash and go to a completely digital system, because if we have only digital transactions, they get a cut of every transaction, and they get our data, right? So and unfortunately for a country like Australia, you don't have reliable communications and power infrastructure, and if you just have digital, you will have natural disasters and other problems that leave many communities high and dry and can't transact, right? That's why cash is important. You've got to keep it there. So the banks don't care about that. And a postal bank can be, given that you've got 4,300 post offices in Australia, that can be the branches of a government bank that if we want to, we can all bank at. We don't have to. We can still use a private bank if we prefer them. But if we want to, we can bank at that. And it will always provide a service. It'll guarantee our money. It'll be able to use our money to invest in infrastructure for Australia, lend to local government, and all that sort of thing. And it can just bring some honesty back into the financial system. And the most important part is it'll force the big four banks to compete. Yeah. And if they have to compete, they'll have to raise their standards.
I just want to bring up something you brought up. Very interesting what you said, and about online banking. All these big major overseas banks or international banks are pushing people online banking. You don't get many tellers left when you go to the bank. You get no interaction. Now, if we move towards, say, digital currency and online banking on the internet, and this can affect Australians in regional area and Indigenous people in regional areas where they don't have good access to internet. Yep. What happens to, and I want to talk about Indigenous communities like Jida, who did my painting for me, who lives out in the Yolngu and Maningrida area. What happens to them under digital currency when they don't get the good internet coverage, which they don't, because out in Arnhem Land, out in the middle of Maningrida, you can't. They've got a post office probably out there. What happens to them?
Exactly. This is a huge problem. And we need to use those aspects of it to shame these politicians who will tell you that they want to close the gap between Indigenous communities and the rest of Australia. They tell you all that. Well, these are the practical things that they have to look at. And that means making the banks behave. These banks are rogue. Think about another aspect of the online digital stuff. We're being bombarded at the moment, and it's been just brewing for quite a few years now, about the dangers of online scams and hackers. And when it comes to banking, it's not like going to the veggie store and picking your best apple or your best avocado, right? When you get that avocado, their sign says, don't squeeze the avocado because they don't want to break. But you want to pick that avocado. Is this perfect to eat right now, right? And you think it is, and you leave the store and you cut it open, and if it is, great. And if it's not a little bit of brown, you go, oh, well, okay, I'll have to live with that. But you know, that's you're used to that kind of uncertainty. But with banking, you want absolute certainty. You're doing your banking. You need absolute certainty. And for a lot of people, especially the older cohort, that certainty comes from face-to-face transactions, Daryl. And they're being told, no, you're not going to have that anymore. You have to go online where all you're hearing about is scammers and hackers who target you, right? So even doing the transactions online are really complex, and people scratch their, have I done this right, etc., right? They don't have the assurance of a teller doing it for them. And then they don't know if they answer the phone if they're about to have their whole life savings ripped away from them. And that's what the government is allowing these banks to force people into.
And
right?
one thing, Robbie, about what you said is that I want to go back to what I was talking about with the Indigenous communities. This is how Anglo-centric they are. So what's that going to do is this digital, it's going to force Indigenous communities in their communities, like out in Maningrida and all those homelands, off their homelands to the cities to access internet.
Yeah.
Where they're off practicing culture on their land where they want to be, like, and forced into the cities where a lot of people out in those homelands, English is a second language, right? So they get little support. So, you know, it embolden those homeland areas. This is my take. Have a post office bank which a community can get around in those homeland areas. Embolden those homeland areas. They can be places for tourism and so on. But and that's one example. The other example is rural and regional farmers in areas out in the Never Never. They'll also be heavily impacted. What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to them? So I'm not dividing between two groups of impact. Both are going to be heavily impacted. I think Indigenous communities are going to be very heavily impacted because they're walking between two worlds, okay, between cultural world and between, you know, our world. So, you know, you've got to remember they've got a second tier of obligations, and to put this upon them and upon the other people in the rural communities in Australia, the mainstream or Anglo-Australians in the regional communities, that's going to be a horrible impact.
It's why we supported the scrapping of the cashless debit card as well, which was, you know, they used the Indigenous community as a Trojan horse, frankly, to try and bring in something that was going to go much bigger. And it's about the principle of the thing. You don't force people to make these kind of changes. There will come a time, Daryl, when society is like if we don't blow up in a nuclear war, there will come a time when society is like the Jetsons, and all this technology is second nature, right? And that's generations away. We're not there yet, and real technology gets embraced naturally. People embrace it and go with it. You don't force it. Well, we have a situation now where the banks are trying to force it. They claim they've signed up people to online banking. Then they have figures saying, 90% of customers in this branch are registered for online banking. But then they have to admit that only 25% are using it, right? Because people prefer the other way, and for a lot of good reasons. So our bank ticks a lot of different boxes. Our proposal for a postal bank. It's the cheapest way to provide it because the post offices are already there. It'll compete with the big banks. It'll make, if they don't want to lose all their customers to a postal bank, they will start to improve the way they do business, right? And it can guarantee all these services, and that's what's very, very important. And
the point on what you said, because I really want to catch this point. Doesn't matter whether it's Indigenous community or non-Indigenous community, right? The cashless card is like, it's not teaching people about how to have budgets and economically save and work out finances on both communities. We should be putting education in schools on that, rather than just saying, oh, here's a cashless card, we don't trust you, you're going to get this. But that's not empowering people how to take care of their own finances and teaching them those methods. And remember that also in Indigenous communities, they have family obligations in their financial system, their own financial system.
Yep.
We can come and try to understand that cultural system, adapt to it, and show, and we can, you know, learn from them, and they can learn from us in how can you balance this system with your cultural needs. So it's bypassing that. It's saying, here's a card, we don't trust you with money, take it. And that's for both communities. Yeah.
They've given me an idea there, because I think we're going to have to recruit more Aboriginal community support for our postal bank for those reasons.
Yep.
And because we want every community that's going to benefit, every constituency that's going to benefit, to get behind the campaign, because I think we can actually win. We can achieve this, but we're going to have a big fight with the private banks first.
And to all those people on the left, or the traditional left, take note of this. What is your current Labor Party doing in regards to this issue of economic sovereignty? As far as, you know, with pushing people into this online system, and the impact on Indigenous communities, which the Labor Party supposedly care about. So, you know, this is what I want to be, you know, fair income about is let's have these discussions, because we're not, and the Labor Party are not having these discussions and will not have these discussions. And I think the Liberal Party, yeah, won't go near these discussions either. There needs to be a new way.
Yeah, I agree.
So, you know, you're Robbie, it's great discussing these issues with you, because I think we've got to search for a new way, and we've got to reach out to each other in different political spectrums and cut down that divide. And it's not about right, left. It's not about that. It's about the issues.
Problem solving, Daryl.
And problem solving. Problem solving, exactly. And more communication, more discussion, less polarization.
Yeah, I agree. No, 100%.
Look, Robbie, thank you so much for your discussions. You've given a lot of your time. We'll
thanks for having me on. Thanks for reaching out. I was impressed with your efforts at online so far. So keep it up.
We talked about it, Mr. Miles's office.
Mr. Miles's office. That was very good. So keep all that up. If people can follow us at citizensparty.org.au, or look up the Citizens Report on YouTube. We have our own YouTube channel. And yeah, let's keep talking.
I'll place those links in the description of this YouTube video, and I'll also place my research blog in regards to the neo-Nazi factions in Ukraine, and also evidence of, you know, Australians have fought over there with neo-Nazi factions, which I personally believe in wrap up that our World War II veterans who fought Nazis would be discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for your time, Robbie.
Thanks, Daryl.
Enjoy your day. Thanks, mate.
Good, mate.
Bye, mate.
Bye.